And I know you recently wrote an article that I would like to discuss today. You said in the article that the United States seeks to pursue the Western totalitarian state by means of pulling down the European economy from the broken system to emerge the reconstruction of oppressive fascism. A wrecked Western economy is prerequisite. Can you expand a little bit on this?
Yes, this is very difficult for most Americans to hear, but we all accept the historical background of the United States. It's the cradle of capitalism, the beacon of freedom. Not anymore. I mean, can you point to anything where we're a cradle of capitalism? Can you point to anything where we're a beacon of freedom? No, we're a primary axis for fascism now. When did it really change? Well, Bush and Clinton in the 1990 decade. I don't pay attention to political party. I pay attention to association with the bankers and the military-industrial complex. The rest is distraction and noise. In the 1990 decade, Clinton and Bush changed everything. They stole Fort Knox. They stole the U.S. government reserves for gold by installing a 0% gold lease privilege that you could not use, but Wall Street banks could. So we saw a rather historical drop in the interest rate, and they capitalized on that by going long on bond futures contracts. And they capitalized on the suppression of gold and the gutting of gold by going short on gold futures contracts. I estimate that Rubin and his gang made somewhere on the order of $2 or $3 trillion by raiding the U.S. gold. So then the 9/11 incidents pretty much killed the national spirit, installed fascism. I call the Patriot Act the fascist manifesto. Patriot Act shredded the Constitution. Is anybody paying attention to this? The banker cabal wishes to install across the Western world a totalitarian state. One of the chief architects for this is David Rockefeller. He's about 96 years old now. And it's funny, he's got a little side project. They call it 2020. They want to be able to download a human brain's contents, thoughts, memories, belief systems, personality, emotional stuff. They want to download it into a computer so that it could be uploaded later into a different body. That's what David Rockefeller is working on, and Kissinger is one of his main buddies for that. So the plan is you cannot have a totalitarian state, which is just extreme fascism, without wrecking the economy. They want to wreck the U.S. economy. They want to wreck the European economy and install fascism. And one of the chief architects for the banking side of this was Greenspan. He gave the Americans what they wanted, easy money. He gave them what they wanted for asset bubbles. And on the other side of easy money and debt saturation, and on the other side of broken asset bubbles, is a wrecked financial system and a wrecked economic system. This is utterly basic. So the U.S. really can't install this totalitarian state across the Western world as long as Europe is semi-healthy. Now, the pigs nations and all their sovereign debt, they pretty much wrecked the South, but the U.S. and I call them the castle dwellers, the banker cabal, they need to wreck Europe the rest of the way, and they need to prevent Europe from joining through the pipelines, the energy pipelines with Russia. So that's what this Ukraine war is all about, to prevent Russia from joining in a tight way commercially and financially with Europe. The U.S. doesn't want that. The U.S. wants to wreck Europe so that they can have the totalitarian state. We hear it called the New World Order, NWO, and I don't like to talk about that name in depth, but this is basically what it's all about. The Ukraine war is a final desperation to take down Europe and prevent it from marrying Russia. That's how I see it, Elijah.
And speaking of Russia, how do you see that the Russian sanctions are going to impact the U.S. dollar, and also how do you see them impacting the European economy?
All right, there's a shared Russian trade function regarding banking, food, weapons, and they've all been halted to Europe. There have been interruptions. There have been obstructions. And these are very organized and orchestrated. It includes the oligarchs. And the U.S. government and the EU like to try to make themselves look noble by identifying Russian oligarchs. And really all they're trying to do is attack and limit the best friends of the Kremlin. It's a bad plan. Okay, the entire energy supply to Europe from Russian oil and gas sources is to be threatened. And I've got some pretty reliable word from my sources that say we may see just about anything on the table interrupted except Gazprom gas. That's how important it is. So it's kind of funny, really, if it weren't so tragic, that they're going to block food, but they're not going to block energy. They're going to block banking, but they're not going to block energy. They're going to block oligarch activity, but not energy. They're going to block credit cards, but not energy. It's really not a good plan. But in response, these Eastern powers, I believe, are going to work toward a non-dollar alternative. And that's kind of a zip word you hear nowadays in the press. Anytime you hear non-dollar alternative, just think return to the gold standard. The press does not like to even mention gold standard by title. If they see gold standard efforts, they'll call it dollar alternative and try to paint it as some kind of a terrorist event. Eventually, Europe is going to work toward this alternative system, joining the East. I think it's just locked into the future. And notice that the U.S. government is busy prosecuting the French banks like BNP Paribas for sanctioned violations, busy prosecuting Swiss banks like Credit Suisse for tax evaders and private account disclosure violations. And notice that in progress, and it's going to get, I think, just blown completely crazy, is the U.S. government prosecuting Deutsche Bank in Germany. And they've already given a preliminary hypocritical statement that they're going after Deutsche Bank for derivatives, fraudulent activity in derivatives, and for fraudulent activity in the Forex currency market, which is precisely what the London banks do and precisely what there was no prosecution for. So, Elijah, we've got this tremendous hypocrisy coming and pressure on European nations to break away from the United States in its fold. Elijah, this is going to get out of control, and it's already a little bit out of control.
And you mentioned that this is just isolating the United States. You mentioned in your article that the U.S. government will succeed with a series of new sanctions in isolating the majority of the world's nations. In doing so, it will isolate itself. So can you expand a little bit on how you see this happening?
Well, yeah, imagine that you're in a fraternity and you've got 25 young men, and one guy says to 8 fellows, I don't want to eat with you, I don't want to go out partying with you, I don't want to drink with you, I don't want to go to football games with you. And then a week later, takes a look around and says, you 5 guys, you really bother me. I don't like how you associate with those 8 guys I really hate. Okay, and then later you've got, a few more, and they're kind of quiet types, wallflowers, and you just kind of leave them alone. And before you know it, you've only got 2 friends out of 25 because you've isolated yourself from 22 of them. What have you succeeded in doing? You've isolated yourself from the whole fraternity. The whole fraternity is going to go about its business, partying, going to school, going out for meals, having meals inside, studying together, talking about girls, sporting events. What have you accomplished? You don't have any friends. So the United States has sanctioned Sudan, sanctioned Cuba, sanctioned Iran, sanctioned Russia. They refuse to sanction China. Isn't that interesting? That's because they hold so much debt. Well, I think the real big wild card will be when the United States starts talking trash with Germany. That's when I think everything is going to change. So you've got sanctions after sanctions after sanctions, and these are to the enemy states. But then you've got bank fines after bank fines after bank fines, and these are to the allied partner states. Now, I like to say that the Nazis attack their enemies, defraud their allies, strangle and put in a straitjacket their own subjects in the population, all while deep criminality goes unpunished. So the result is that Nazis always isolate themselves. It's all through history. And the American people don't like to think of themselves as being led by Nazis. But that's what they are. Neocon means Nazi. People need to wake up. The Bush II administration was the first Nazi administration. And what was their first act and deed? 9/11. And the preliminary to that was the Clinton administration, where they stole all the gold. One of the ugliest little secrets in American politics is how the Bush family and the Clinton family are best friends. It crosses party lines. They're narco friends. They're Nazis.
And I wanted to move our focus back to some of the sanctions that we were talking about. I know that ExxonMobil, Dutch Shell, British Petroleum, and Boeing do not support the sanctions against Russia. How do you see this affecting, as you've called, the fascist business model?
Well, first let's review what it is. The fascist business model involves a merger, kind of a meeting of the minds, hearts and minds, of major corporations working in collusion with the government, which permits crime, deep crime. I'm talking about multi-trillion-dollar crime with these major corporations committed by them. So the Department of Justice does not pursue the Wall Street banks. No, you've got investor lawsuits, a few billion here, a few billion there. But there was a major lawsuit that was thrown out. I think Homeland Security and the Langley boys made threats to the judges involved in a big mortgage bond and mortgage contract case. That was in New York State. But we're seeing some pretty interesting patterns emerge. The list you gave of Exxon, Dutch Shell, British Petroleum, and Boeing, those are energy and weapons makers. Okay, well, what's missing in there in the fascist business model? It's the bankers. All right, so what you've got now is a split. This is very interesting split, and nowhere in the news, and absolutely nowhere exposed by any politician in an open discussion. What you've got going on right now is a split, a schism between the Rothschild bankers and the Rockefeller energy companies. And I'd like to point out what the two big violations were by Putin that justified their attack on Russia in the last few months. And this has been planned for a while. In the 2000 decade, Putin made a deal and was pretty close with a number of Rothschild bankers. For instance, a few of them were involved in investing some of the Kremlin reserves, their Forex reserves. You know, they had at one time $160 billion worth of treasury bonds. They've been whittling it down. All right, Putin told the Rothschild bankers, get the hell out of my country. Putin also did something that pissed off the Americans directly by interfering with heroin trade routes coming from Afghanistan. Now, Americans really need to wake up. The Afghan war was to capture the heroin prize, where 80% of the global heroin was produced. And since the United States has been in there since 2003, the heroin production has gone up 13-fold. And just to make fools of the American people, the politicians in the U.S. government are saying, we need to redouble our efforts. We need more funding to fight the Taliban so we can bring this under control. Well, gee, they've got 18 of the 20 Taliban commanders and chiefs in control in the U.S. fold. Why has production gone up 13-fold? It's because it's a resounding success story. Putin got in the way of trade routes, distribution routes, like into Eastern Europe. If we've got a case where some energy companies and a major weapon manufacturer, Boeing, are not towing the line within the fascist crowd for their business model, then I think we've got a deep division in that fascist alliance. I think the bankers and the energy companies are in a big split. Exxon is continuing with the Black Sea offshore oil production. Exxon is continuing with the Arctic exploration with Russia. Exxon is continuing with the Siberian exploration with Russia. British Petroleum and Dutch Shell have basically said, these sanctions don't apply to us. Why? Because there's a schism, and they're bigger than Obama, or they're equal. Obama is just a figurehead. It's really quite sad, especially the death of Joan Rivers after she outed Obama and his sexual preferences. I remember 2 months ago I had a conversation with a couple clients and colleagues, and I said, I give it 50-50 that Joan Rivers is dead in a couple months. I don't know how it'll happen. I don't care how it'll happen. Probably something minor, medical, and before you know it, she's gone. Okay, so these Nazi bankers, Elijah, are on the extreme defensive. There's a schism going on between the bankers and the energy firms. And keep in mind, most of them are Satanists on both sides, the bankers and the energy firms. They're Satanists.
And you also mentioned that Germany is not going along with fascism either. So how and why do you see that Germany is not going along with the move towards fascism?
Germany's always been protective of their economy and their industry and their labor force. They tend not to betray them. They tend not to wreck them. The United States wrecks everything in its land. The leaders. Outsourcing was a betrayal of the labor force. Outsourcing was the forfeiting of industry to Asia. Outsourcing brought in the new trend of asset bubble dependence, stock market, housing, that ended badly in the United States. Outsourcing resulted in insolvent banks that brought about the 1990 decade of the derivatives for the banking system. There's a deep division in Germany between the bankers and politicians. The politicians are basically run by the bankers, just like in the United States. In the United States, Rockefeller and the Wall Street cabal, they run the White House. They let them know exactly what they're going to do and how the press will paint it. Okay, so the division in Germany is between the bankers and the commercial chiefs. Okay, you've got 3,000 or more German companies doing business in Russia. Are they all going to stop? I don't think so. Merkel's playing a very difficult game. I think she's playing to the bankers, giving the U.S. lip service, and making empty promises to the U.S. and NATO warmongers. There was an event a month ago. I think it was in early August, mid-August. The Germans announced that they were not going to supply fighter aircraft to the NATO forces in Ukraine. And I thought, whoa, that's a split. That doesn't sound like a normal event in an alliance. So, Merkel also did something in the Wales NATO summit just a few days ago. She actually made a strong statement with other nations standing behind her that certain treaty elements would not be honored anymore. And the U.S. press just totally ignored it. European press didn't ignore it. A couple of sources of mine didn't ignore it. Because what it meant was Merkel was telling the Americans and British that certain planks holding the gut of all of the NATO treaty together didn't apply anymore. Now, what does that mean? To me, it means that NATO is pretty much dead. I got word 2 weeks ago from my excellent source, The Voice, who's got tremendous contacts throughout Europe and Asia, but he's European. So he's got a lot of contacts from his, the first 30 years of life on planet Earth. The Germans, the Swiss, and the French, and the Dutch. He's got a lot of contacts, Austrians. And what he told me was that there were special forces type professional troops from Germany, France, Holland, and England who were fighting against the Kiev regime in Ukraine. They call it something like the Ukraine freedom movement, or I don't know, liberation. I hate the word liberation. Liberate from what? From usage of a bra? I mean, what is liberation? Okay, I don't wear underwear anymore. I'm liberated. Okay, great. You're running around commando style. Okay, but these German, French, Dutch, and British special troops, it's not even clear they're being paid. They're working and fighting against the NATO troops in Ukraine. They're fighting against the Kiev regime in Ukraine. If NATO were healthy, this would not happen. I've also heard from a different source that Germany has already decided and committed toward working with Russia and China on a gold trade standard. Everybody's looking at each other at summit meetings thinking, where's the solution to this mess? We're doing rescues of banks. We're doing rescues of bonds. We're printing out free money. We're covering enormous deficits. We're putting in austerity poison pills. None of this is working. Nothing is getting fixed. There are no remedies. What are we going to be doing here? Everybody is starting to realize now the answer, the solution, is a return to the gold standard. You can't allow the Americans to print trillions of dollars to cover their debt and give to their bankers and expect no consequence with the rest of the world on the cost structure to the global economy. That's why there's no unlimited time factor here. QE is a death sentence. Zero interest rate is a death sentence. And what it means is that you're walking the global economy, in particular the U.S. economy, the global cost structure is walking toward the electric chair. There are a limited number of steps before you sit in the electric chair because the global economy has a daily consequence and effect from QE and the bond monetization. It means the cost structure is going up. The effect on capital is very detrimental. I call it capital destruction. Others call it capital retirement. Like you take that equipment offline. You're not using it anymore because your cost structure has gone up and your profit margin's gone away. That's the time element having to do with QE and the bond monetization. It's hyper-monetary inflation, which we learned for 40 years in school was a bad thing. But when the U.S. does it, it's a good thing and it's stimulus. Why is that? Because it's frickin' Nazi economics. Germany has already decided to work with China and Russia on a new gold return, a new gold standard in trade. Germany has already decided to abandon the euro and NATO and move away from the European Union. Germany has already decided with the Dutch, Austrians, and Finland to work on a direct alternative. And I think these four nations are going to break away from the European Union simultaneously. Germany has made enormous inroads with Russia regarding energy and railways. Germany's made enormous inroads with China, having to do with exports, industrial equipment, construction equipment. These are not going to go into reverse. Germany has experienced fascism in the past 70 years ago. They don't want any more. Germany has experienced hyperinflation in the past 70 years ago. They don't want any more. The United States is ready for fascism. It is the natural end chapter to capitalism. Do you see any evidence of capitalism in the United States? I don't, Elijah. You've got a majority of Americans now on the federal dole, and they're the main Obama voters. Yeah, I want extended welfare. Yeah, I want aid to dependent children. Yeah, I want unemployment compensation extended to 99 weeks and maybe 199 weeks. I'm voting for Obama. That's change I can believe in. I think Americans are some of the biggest fools in the history of the world. And finally they're beginning to wake up, and it's really no more than 5 or 10%. And I applaud them because they're hat trick letter subscribers. But the other 90 to 95%, they're going to get plowed under. The U.S. is going to be liquidated. The dollar is going to go away. With the abuse with 0% and bond monetization and QE is going to result in the United States losing the dollar as a global reserve currency. And then it's, third world, dead ahead.
And I wanted to discuss a little bit more about what you were talking about, Germany pivoting east. I know we discussed a little bit about this in our last interview. And did you want to give us an update, like what events you've seen since our last interview that confirm or alter your view on this?
Yeah, there are basically three big events, and, not in any kind of time order. But last weekend in Wales, Merkel, the German chancellor, made some statements that were very clear that certain elements of the treaty were no longer going to be honored. Well, what does that mean? NATO's going to be a country club where they sit around and have drinks? What is NATO if the integral treaties are not going to be primary to their purpose? Well, maybe the NATO meeting will just kind of be an offshoot to the G7. Where they can sit around and talk about, hey, we got some really cool new patches to put on for the banking system. We got some new weapons we really like, and I know some of you are going to sell them to Russia and provide engines, diesel engines to China, but isn't this NATO gang fun? Can you pass me another martini? I mean, what is NATO if they don't have their treaties as an integral part? The second event, this happened a month ago, the German government, I mentioned before, refused to supply further jet aircraft for the war in Ukraine. Well, gosh, How's NATO doing? What is NATO if Germany says we're not going to supply fighter aircraft? All right, well, maybe the Italians will. It's a joke. We got NATO undermined. The third event was much, I think, bigger and much quieter. Merkel has been working in private with the Kremlin, face-to-face discussions between Putin and Merkel on Ukraine and European peace talks. And the gut of the discussion is Crimea is annexed by Russia, and I think perhaps eastern Ukraine, but let's just focus on Crimea. Crimea is taken by Russia, and Gazprom is assured no interruption of energy supply to Europe. So it's basically, carve up Ukraine and let's keep it stable and keep the pipelines flowing for gas to Europe. So it's Crimea for Gazprom. That's the gut of the Merkel-Putin peace talks, which the United States is interfering with. Recall that Obama won a peace prize. I think he does more on the golf course than he did to earn a peace prize. I don't think he earned the peace prize by playing golf, but he just set a record, 148 rounds of golf while president. So if you take away his rounds of golf and his fundraising events, I'm not sure that he's really doing anything. All right, this is where we stand. Germany is making very loud noises, and in private, they're letting their Russian and Chinese commercial partners know exactly where they stand regarding leaving the euro, leaving the Union, and leaving NATO. That's how I see it. That's what I'm hearing, Elijah.
Did you want to summarize a little bit on how NATO is being undermined by sanctions and war?
Sure. Member nations must permit wreckage of their economies to support the U.S. Nazi war. People need to understand the entire Ukraine war is a project out of Langley, funded by Langley. And the news was given away several months ago. The United States, through Langley, invested $5 billion to have a regime change, also called a coup d'etat. So if member nations must permit wreckage of their economies, then you're going to see pressure to break away from NATO. The second thing is member nations must suffer the consequences of Russian retaliatory sanctions. We saw a few weeks ago the Russians say, all right, we've had enough. You want to keep poking a stick in the Russian bear's eye? Well, fine. We're not going to buy your food anymore. We don't have any interest in Spanish, Italian, German, French food being exported from your countries to Russia. We're going to find alternative sources, and they are, in China and all kinds of South American countries. So, at the World Cup in Brazil in July, I think arrangements were being made for agricultural export to Russia. So these member nations are going to have damage to their farms, their big agribusinesses. And I think you're going to start seeing in the next 6 months the Chinese buying up giant European agribusinesses, farming businesses. The third thing is member nations will be forced to deal with repercussions from their indigenous population. The Spanish just had a big peach protest. The Spanish are starting to give away food to just let the point be known to their government that they're wrecking the system. I think the Spanish agricultural business is going to be in focus in a very big way, especially when the first offer comes in by a Chinese company to buy it out, because it's going to alter the export I really thought that there might be a chance that Turkey would act as an intermediary, send your agricultural export to Turkey, and we'll distribute it to Russia as we see fit. It hasn't happened yet. Maybe it has more than I know. But these farmers are making a lot of noises, and we know most revolutions take place over issues having to do with food. The fourth and last thing to note is that member nations will be forced to face their corporate chiefs to explain policy. Why have you wrecked our export business, you clowns? Remember, the European Union commissioners are not elected. They're waging war with huge consequences to the European Union economies. They're not elected. Who are they? I don't think 99% of Americans could name a single European Union commissioner. Yet they're waging war. Who are they? Why are they doing it? I think it has to do precisely with wrecking the European Union economy to bring about the totalitarian state. Notice the empty promises given by the U.S. government to Europe. They say put sanctions in against Russia. We will guarantee your oil and gas because we've got surpluses in North America. What's a load of crap? The United States has a hard time conducting refinery processes for all the very light crude oil that come from shale oil projects. This is a global mess that the United States is creating. This is not going to end well. This is not going to result in any kind of recovery. I talk to smart people with economics backgrounds and degrees, and I hear the same nonsense, vapid crap over and over again. The U.S. always comes out of it. Not this time because of outsourcing and because of the 1999 most favored nation status given to China, where we reindustrialized China and gutted our industries and therefore gave away our legitimate core of income. So the member nations of European Union and NATO are going to fracture off. That's my view, Elijah. It's going to take time, but it's happening right now.
I wanted to turn our focus to the petrodollar. I know you recently reported that the Gazprom Neft Corporation announced acceptance of Chinese yuan and Russian rubles for payment for crude oil sold to Europe and to China. So what do you see the consequences of this to be?
Well, this is actually a correct jackass forecast that I made in March and April. I said we're going to have a very unusual situation where Russian energy trade is going to accept Chinese currency and payment outside the dollar sphere. And it's finally happening. It's a correct forecast. The word neft in Russian means oil. Not necessarily oil directly, but it means oil firm. Gazprom Neft is the oil firm behind Gazprom. Gazprom is the giant natural gas monopoly inside Russia. Gazprom Neft is their oil firm. So I think Gazprom decided, all right, let's just have a little trial balloon here. Let's let our oil company subsidiary go out and say, we will trade with Europe and get paid in rubles. Let's trade with China and get paid in yuan. And if the Europeans want to use yuan, fine, we can accept that too. Well, what does it mean with respect to the ruble and the yuan? It means they're going to be pretty soon interchangeable. I like to point out the joke, the stupidity, trying to isolate Russia. Well, it's got 12 or 13 time zones. I got corrected recently. There are only 10 time zones, but there's a 12-hour difference from one end to the other. From Vladivostok to St. Petersburg, it's a 12-hour difference. All right, so you can't isolate a country that big, nor can you isolate a country that has so many connections now with China. So we've had a de facto petrodollar standard for since 1970, so for 40 years. And this started after the the Arab embargo in 1973. And notice in 1973, the Arab embargo and all the movement toward the petrodollar as a standard, recycling OPEC and Saudi petro profits surplus into dollars and treasury bond. Notice that all happened in 73, 2 years after we broke the gold standard, Bretton Woods. Okay, that was the replacement standard. So what that meant was we're not going to have a gold standard anymore, but we're going to let the Rockefellers control the dollar standard. All right, that was quite a coup by the Rockefellers. All right, that has stood for 40 years as a stable force. Notice in the last few months the Saudis are permitting a fast erosion in the petrodollar. They're having a big conference every single month with Chinese business interests, banking interests, minister-level meetings. And I think what they're doing is they're getting ready to install a Chinese yuan standard for oil payments that Europe can honor too. Hey, look, Germany, you want to buy oil from the Persian Gulf nations? Well, you can buy it in yuan. So that's going to maybe further along the Frankfurt RMB hub center, the Chinese RMB renminbi hub center. It's going to be a big phenomenon. The RMB hub will be used for bond trade in Chinese currency denomination and currency translation. So the RMB hubs are going to be very big. So now you've got soon, I think, the entire OPEC cartel is going to accept non-dollar payments for oil. And then all the Persian Gulf, they're going to do the same while they're working closely with Russian energy firms. Just take a look at Gazprom connections in Qatar. So if Europe buys Russian oil and gas without dollar usage, then the big double whammy is if that happens with the Persian Gulf doing the same thing. Then you'd have the Saudis and the Russians, number one and number two. The Russians are number one, by the way, in oil production. The Saudis and Russians not accepting oil, well, gee, that means the petro standard is gone for the dollar. The petrodollar standard is not in use anymore. Well, what's the consequence of that? You know, I talk to a lot of Americans, and I haven't met a single one that understands that when you pay for oil in dollars, you keep treasury bonds in your banking system as core reserves. And when you stop paying dollars for oil, you stop using the treasury bonds in your banking system. They're connected. So the dollar is going to lose its global reserve status as the core asset in Western banking system. This is the consequence. The European banks are going to start to diversify away from the treasury bond and the dollar. The European banks will no longer require treasury bonds in their banking system because they don't need them to buy oil. I mean, Americans are some of the worst economists in the history of the world. We need to re-educate ourselves on what money is, what capital is, and how war destroys economies. We need to relearn this. Watch London walk a fine line because they are trying desperately to create a Chinese RMB hub. Again, for bond trade in the Chinese currency and currency translation like for the yuan. The Chinese yuan, I think, is going to serve as a caretaker function, Elijah, for a return to the gold trade standard. And eventually you're going to see things like a gold trade note, a short-term letter of credit type note. I think it's going to be interchangeable with the Chinese yuan later. So a lot of things are happening. A lot of things are undermining NATO and the dollar. And I think this Ukraine war, I called it the Waterloo for the dollar. I bet you 90% of Americans don't know what Waterloo for the dollar means. It means death, end, execution, rejection. I think Ukraine is a grand error, if not part of a very destructive plan to bring about the end of the dollar. I was told back in 2008 that Obama was going to be elected because he was selected to kill the dollar. We're seeing it now.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching. That's it for part 1. Make sure to click here to subscribe so you will be notified when part 2 is released. This video was brought